Thank you, everybody, for being here and also online. As Miko said, I will talk today a little bit about the general sort of the global history of reintroductions and also focus on the specific case of the Przewalski's horse. And I will not focus only on the reintroduction, but give you a glimpse in the longer history of the horse throughout the 20th century. Okay. Cool. So one of the big questions that guides me as a historian of conservation is, what can humans do when they are confronted with wildlife extinctions? And what have they done in the course of the 20th century? And I ask also like more empirical questions that help me in my research. For instance, how does conservation actually work? And how do particular projects evolve? How do scientists proceed? What are their practices? And so when we hear about big conservation success stories, like the one of the Przewalski horse, or like the one of the black-footed ferret or the whooping crane, when species have been saved from extinction, what is actually happening there? So what is the history of these projects? What lies behind and before this success is sort of declared? So my research is at an intersection between conservation history, zoo history, animal history, and the history of science. And all of these sort of fields are necessary to approach this kind of research. And I will, on this slide, I put quite a lot of instances of my research to give you a glimpse into what does a wildlife historian do. So when you think of history, you think of archives, probably, of like state archives, repositories that are curated, and historians going there and looking into documents to recover facts. But the history of the Przewalski horse has occurred over many places, and few of them have such a conventional archive. So what I did was my research began actually at the time when COVID-19 also began in 2020. So I started with a lot of online research and reading monographs and articles that sort of gave me an idea about what was going on with the horse. I also did a lot of online interviews with scientists and zoo curators and people who participated in the recovery of the horse from the late 80s and beginning of the 90s. I went but I also, so when the COVID-19 sort of travel bans relaxed, I also went to visit many zoos that have Przewalski horses. And here I put a picture from Prague Zoo that was very important in the history of the horse. And they have an archive. And also Helsinki Zoo has bred the Przewalski horses, and they have actually recently reintroduced horses to the Dzungarian Gobi. I also went on a fieldwork trip to Mongolia, and my purpose there was to recover some of the documents and to understand them with the help of a translation from the local director. So all of that in that cupboard, I sort of poked my nose into that. And I interviewed the director of the reintroduction, who was there from 25, he started 25 years ago. So he was a really excellent interlocutor. And also, although historians not always do field work, and in the traditional sense, like going out and seeing the landscape and the animals, I did that like on a daily basis. I went out with the director and with the wildlife biologist to sort of observe the horses and the landscape and try to imagine how the space was like 30 years ago and so on. So that is the kind of research that I did. But now let me go back to the beginning of the 20th century. to give you a glimpse into sort of how the story, the human story, if you wish, of the horse had began. I will go fast through this history, although there are many interesting things, but like we have only maybe 20 minutes left, so it's not a long time to cover a full century. So the Przewalski horses are known to be the last undomesticated horse species on the earth, and they were so by the time that they were discovered, so to say, by science in 1881, and they were described as a distinct species. They were already very rare, and they existed only in the area that is the border between China and Mongolia, the Dzungarian Gobi. And they fascinated because of that rarity. They had a lot of value for animal collectors and for zoos. They were really like a fascinating species at the time. So by the end of the 19th century, as they became known to the world of science, they were also, several collectors wanted to have live animals in their collections. So they set out to commission animal traders to capture some of the horses. And what they did was they captured foals. It was a very violent sort of capture where they usually killed the mothers and took the foals that sometimes did not survive. They were feeding them, like they used domestic mares to feed the horses, but the foals, but it was a very difficult sort of instance to survive. And the animal traders spread the horses around the world. So here you see some of the locations where the horses arrived already by 1910. So they arrived in North America, they arrived in Australia, they arrived at this reserve in southern Ukraine, which is Askania Nova. It was a very important site at the time. There was a very large estate owned by a landowner, Friedrich Waldswein, and he was very interested. He was the first who commissioned the capturing of the horses. Also, so the trader who he didn't capture, but he bought 60 foals and spread them around at the zoos was Karl Hagenbeck, and he owned the largest business of animal trade in the beginning of the 20th century. And here are some of the foals pictured at his stables near Hamburg at Stellingen. So as you see, the history of keeping the Przewalski horses in captivity, which would prove to be actually the way to keep the species alive, is intimately related to the history of wildlife trade and with zoo history. So the horses went to these many locations, but at the time of World War II, only 9 individuals survived and reproduced, and they were located only at Prague Zoo and Munich Zoo. And this is very important because the horses in Prague Zoo were descended from a hybrid. And it was considered that the Prague line was impure. The other line, breeding line in Munich Zoo, where we had a director, Heinz Heck, with affinities with the Nazi Party. And he was a very interesting character. And what he was doing, he was sort of doing a lot of experiments with breeding. He bred, for instance, what is called today the Heck cattle. He was trying to de-extinct the aurochs. He was also trying to breed tarpans, to de-extincted tarpan horses. And with the Przewalski horses, he really valued them very much, and he wanted to keep a pure strain. So he was the one who sort of called the Prague line a contaminated, a tainted line. And so these two breeding lines were not exchanging horses, which meant that they became very, very inbred. So only from 9 individuals, there's a tiny genetic pool. After the war, there is a community of Przewalski horses experts, and they were zoo breeders and scientists, like, for instance, these people pictured here at the conference in 1959 that was organized by Prague Zoo. And there were Enamor, who is here in the picture. He assembled what is called the stud book. So he studied the pedigrees of all the known horses that have circulated in the zoo world and assembled this fantastic database that was the second stud book for a wild species in history. The first one was the European bison. And with this data set, they were able to understand for the first time, like, what is going on, how much do the horses, for instance, live in captivity? They didn't know at the time anything about these horses, right? And at this conference, they also, so in 1969, there were 60 horses in existence in the zoos. And there were rumors that the horses have already gone extinct in the wild, or that they are only hanging on. Some circulated the number of 40 horses left in the wild. So at this conference, when they came together, they realized that it is a very sort of their passion for the horses is going to probably also save the species in the long run if they keep the horses breeding and the healthy population in zoos. And so, well, I will go a little bit fast forward. So at this conference, there were also discussions to reintroduce the horses. But at the time, so in the 70s and also in the 80s, Mongolia was not really, the Mongolian government was not interested to support a reintroduction. And this changed when the Soviet Union collapsed and the government changed. And this new government was really interested to bring the horses back to their homeland, and they initiated discussions with the breeders and with the various groups that were interested to reintroduce the horses. So, and it was the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s was also a heyday for reintroduction. So in wildlife conservation history, reintroductions became fashionable in the 70s and very much so in the 80s. And in the late 80s, they also consolidated as an IUCN group that was specially dedicated to reintroductions. And so at the time, there was sort of more knowledge accumulating, like how should reintroductions be done and what are the risks. However, it's interesting that one of the groups, so the Mongolian government didn't have a lot of experience, actually no experience with reintroductions, and there were a few different groups attempting to do a reintroduction. And one of them was a group of enthusiasts from the Netherlands that was breeding a group of horses. And the other one was a very interesting figure. It was a German hunter, a Bavarian hunter and businessman who, I mean, you might know that from other histories of wildlife conservation. Hunters have a love of wildlife, right? And they kill wildlife and they also love wildlife. So for Christian Oswald, this businessman that I'm talking about, he became really passionate about returning the horses to their homeland. And so, but because of his profile and because he was not an expert, right? And he was not very well known in this community of zoo experts and scientists, he was not very much liked. So he was in a way a pariah in this community. So the zoo people didn't want to provide horses for this reintroduction. So it was a bit of a history of conflict there. In any case, what Oswald had was money, and he pledged 1.5 million German marks to the project, and also the Mongolian government matched this sum with another 1.5 million German marks, which is equivalent to probably, yeah, all in all, 3 million German marks, which is also 3 million euros roughly today. So for you to get a sense. And they started to do this this reintroduction in the known historical habitat in the Dzungarian Gobi. So what were the horses brought from if the zoo community was against this project? So they were brought first from Ascania Nova. So Ascania Nova at the time, so it was a reserve that they bred the horses, and they had about 100 Przewalski horses at the time. It was the largest stock in the world, and they were in a very dire situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they were previously funded by the state, by the USSR, and suddenly with the change of regime, they really didn't have any funding. So for them, it was important also to have a revenue from providing horses, from selling horses to the reintroduction, also to be able to feed the other horses that they had. So they provided, so the first transport, there were 8 horses brought from Ascania Nova in 1992. The second transport were again another batch of 8 horses. And also there was a reserve in Switzerland called Oberville, also a private foundation that was keen to sort of realize this dream of re-giving freedom to the horses. And they also provided horses in 1995, 1996. It was Australian zoos as well that sent 7 mares in 1995. And they didn't fare so well. So from the 7 mares, only 4 survived. So in the beginning, this project was conceived as a breeding project, returning and breeding the Przewalski horses back in their homeland. It was called Wiedereinbürgerung in German, and rather than Auswilderung, which would mean rewilding. And Auswilderung was the term that the zoo community was using, with the idea that the horses are regaining their freedom after 10 generations in captivity. However, what the Mongolian and the German venture did in the Dzungarian Gobi was to put a fence and to realize what was called a soft release. So to put the horses inside fences, and they were sort of projecting a 10 years sort of captivity in the Gobi phase, and after that to start releases. However, this didn't work very well. There was a lot of international critique. A lot of eyes were on this project, and a lot of critique happened. And so the people did not, in this reintroduction, they did not take into consideration behavioral issues. What they did was to think that if they put what is called harem groups, so a group of mares with a stallion in one enclosure, they would mimic the sort of natural social structure of the horses in the wild, and they would enhance reproduction from day one. But because the fences were not finished from the beginning, they put 2 stallions together. And what happened was that one of the stallions was very aggressive. and he basically harassed and killed the other stallion in the course of a year. And there was, as you can imagine, there was a lot of tension, a lot of stress in the horse group. And even a mare got caught in the fence in one of the fights, and she died afterwards. So if, as a historian, you look very closely at what is happening on the ground, you can find a lot of animal agency. So animals have their will, they have their personalities. As I told you, this one particular stallion was very aggressive. The other one was weaker and younger. He didn't know how to defend very well. The animals get very much stressed, not only from the transport, but also from the social tensions that happen. So they have, if you see, they are coerced and fenced up, but they do have a certain degree of autonomy, and they build their own life worlds in these changed circumstances. And so if a recovery project is to become really successful, it does depend a lot on the animals. So it is very important to notice here that a conservation history is not only a story of human strategy. It's not only a story of human management and technique. It is really a human-animal story in which humans and animals sort of, well, cooperate or they don't cooperate, and they sort of build this project together. And here I will give you, of course, this, so you might ask yourselves, so if this problem and this conflict occurred between the horses, and there were people on the ground who were observing this, why didn't they intervene, right? And I will give you the answer immediately, but before I should explain a little bit like the structure of the actors on the ground. So the Dzungarian Gobi is a really, really remote place. And it was even more remote then than it is now, in a way. And there was a veterinarian who gave up, in a way, his life as a herder and as a veterinarian with a life close to the capital in Ulaanbaatar. And he came to this area, Sukpatar. And he took on the role of director of the project. And he was the one observing the horses. He was the one who was realizing what is going on. But he was not the one taking the big decisions. There was another person that was connecting, that was part of the governmental reintroduction committee, Okir Dojra, and he was virtually the boss of the project. There were also, so in this picture, there was Oswald, who was very much involved, and he wanted to have a big say in all the decisions. And there was also the Ministry of the Environment, which is Bajaga Zamba here in the picture. And because there was so much critique and so much like international sort of opinions about the project, the government was in a very delicate position. Like, what are they doing there? And also Sukpatar was in an even more delicate position because he was on the ground. He wanted to make decisions, but he didn't want to take the blame, so to say. So if he would free one of the horses and the horses would die afterwards, it would have been his responsibility. He would have been blamed for it. So you see how this political and hierarchical relationships between humans can play a very important part in what is going on. So Mongolians are known for horse husbandry and for their love of horses. So in the beginning, they were very confident that they are going to manage and that they have sufficient knowledge to run the project very well, but in very short time, it proved that the Przewalski horses are a different species, of course. And so they were much more nervous, they were much more aggressive than the domestic horses. And so they really sort of didn't know how to manage, but the idea came from, so Oswald asked a panel of international experts, like, what can we do? And the answer was release. So start releasing the horses and let basically horses sort of do what they do, but in an autonomous way. So they released this first group with a very aggressive stallion and a group of mares. What is interesting is that, so they imagined that when they would open the gates, all the horses would run, right? As they are freedom-loving animals, but they didn't. They stayed put. They really didn't go out of the enclosures for days because they were provided, of course, with hay, and they also sort of became accustomed to these enclosures in so many years. So it was now 1997 when they started the first releases. So it was 5 years after they were brought here. So what they started to do was to try to push them to areas that they considered, that the people considered were good for them. So they tried to really herd them. And they did so for 20 kilometers, and then the horses ran back. So that was what they started to call a forced release. And finally, so there were a lot of trials, right? Trials and errors, and people trying to influence and to manage the behavior of the horses, and then the horses responding in very different ways. And some of the horses were more sort of exploratory, others were more sort of attached to the enclosure, so there were very different responses to that. And then at the end of the 1990s, in the beginning of the 2000s, the local team on the ground changed. Supatar was becoming ill as well, and he was eventually replaced with Oyoshankan Gambatar, who came in the Gobi as a very, very young student. He was 20 years old at the time, and he was doing a master thesis. And he was a person with a very keen sense of, very keen eye for individual horses. He could, by the time when I visited the Gobi, there were more than 300 horses in the Gobi, and he knew each and one of them through binoculars, when they were approaching. So there was Oyoshankan Gambatar. He came to study the horses' movements and the use of the territory. Petra Kaczynski arrived in 2002, and she was a scientist at the University of Vienna. There was Chris Walzer as well. There he was also veterinary at the University of Vienna, and he was specialized in telemetry and also in diseases. There was Christian Stauffer, who first in 1997, he pushed a lot for the releases, and he was the one negotiating on the ground with Supatar and with Dorjra to release the horses, which was a hard job to do. And so with this team, and with a lot of horses starting to be released, they started to change the management, so to say. And they tried to attune very much to the behavior of the horses. They observed which horses were more independent, for instance, within the enclosures, and they released them. They observed which of the horses were attached to the enclosures, and they just let them be in there inside instead of forcing them to go further afield. They tried, so they said that also this strategy with reproduction from day one, putting males and females together, was not very good. It was stressing very much the mares. And by adding up the numbers, they realized that it was mares that actually died more in this project. So probably they were very much stressed. So they managed differently this enclosure phase. They put the mares alone together when they arrived. But again, the animal agency was also present here. Some of the stallions jumped the fence and so to the mares enclosure. So there were So I'm telling you all of that because it is very important to see all of these trials, right? And the success of this reintroduction depends on this very fine dynamics, right? Between what the people are trying to do, how they are trying to manage the project, and they look for cues, and then the horses respond, they do something else, and then sort of they learn something, they go further with a different step. There is no plan or strategy that people can lay out on paper in advance and say, we will do this and that, and this will work or not work. So there is a very fine sort of relationship between humans and horses happening there. So by 2009, the horse population was increasing and their movements across the territory was sort of expanding. However, what happened was then in the winter of 2009, 2010, came what is called in Mongolian the dzud. And this is a very harsh sort of phenomena. It's a very harsh winter that happens usually after a very dry summer. And in the dry summer, the horses don't find forage, hay to buy is very expensive because this occurs all over the country and the livestock owners are trying to buy hay to supplement the feed for their animals. And so the project couldn't buy a lot of hay. The horses cannot, so because there is an ice sheet on the ground, the horses cannot sort of find the grass anymore. And what happened was also that these horses stayed in one area. They died massively. So 2/3 of the horses died in that winter. And by the spring of 2010, they were down to 50 individuals. It was a very, very hard blow for the reintroduction project. And they didn't, I mean, they understood that the horses cannot find forage. But the question was whether, so it was nearly 20 years after the first reintroduction. So they started to question whether this project will ever be successful. So if the horses cannot survive, they cannot fend for themselves in this environment. Is this what is this reintroduction, right? So is it ever going to produce self-sufficient animals? And so this is when they were trying to transport hay in the field, and they tried to go near the horses and feed them. The horses were so weak they didn't even want to take the food, and it was snowing so heavily that sometimes people couldn't get out with the trucks. In any case, so they were finally asking a very big question. What happened during captivity? What did these horses lose? Like, did they lose this sort of knowledge of how to actually survive? Do they lose the spatial imagination of the place, of their natural habitat, whatever they might be in a horse's head? What they noticed, it was remarkable in that winter, and I will go back to a slide. So all the horses gathered in this place that is called Koninos, and they died here. But another wild animal in the area, the kulans or the wild asses, they were not seen in this area at all, although in previous winters they would gather here. So they were in a completely different area of the Gobi National Park. They were in the western part. And the scientists started to ask themselves, did the kulans know something about this tooth? Did they have another kind of knowledge that the horses didn't have? And so the kulans, thanks to this knowledge, they were able to survive, while the reintroduced Takis were not. And they realized that it is also depending on, so this knowledge of territory is dependent also on social behavior. So they noticed that, for instance, the Kulans have a different social structure, what is called fusion fission. So they gather in very large numbers at times, but then they go their separate ways. Sometimes there are many solitary animals, or they go in pair. And so they cover a lot of territory in this way. And then when they gather back, they are able to exchange some of the knowledge. So they thought that this might be the answer. And then when the horses will also form smaller groups and they will cover a lot of space, this will come with better knowledge, and eventually this will improve their survival. And so after this crash, there were again reintroductions. Prague Zoo started reintroductions with repurposed army aircrafts to the area, and the population was built up again. And so at the moment when I arrived there in 2022, the population was just crossing over 400, and the conservation story of the Przewalski horse became a success. However, last year there was another Zoot event and they crashed again, not to the same proportion, but still there were an estimate of 100 horses dead. So the question still is there whether this population will eventually become wild, will eventually become self-sufficient. So because I ran out of time, I think I will stop here, and hopefully in the discussion we'll touch upon more points. Thank you very much.
Okay, hey, thank you, Monica, and for an excellent talk. I would have plenty of questions, but I will leave some room for questions from the audience also. But I don't know where to start, because this brought so many ideas. Well, I could actually maybe start by asking you how exceptional is the story of the Przewalski's horse compared to other introductions?
Yeah. It is exceptional in a few ways. So the term reintroduction covers a broad range of situations. In some situations, for instance, the animals were captured from the wild on purpose to be bred in captivity and then reintroduced. But in the case of the horse, they were sort of, the people who wanted to reintroduce them found them already in zoos, so to say. So they were bred in captivity for more than 13 generations, which is quite significant. And also there was no, so the horses became extinct in the wild in 1969. And they became extinct in the wild before people could get a very good understanding of the behavior of the wild horses in the wild, so in this habitat in the Dzungari and Gobi. So by the time of the reintroduction, they didn't know exactly what to expect, how to look at the horses, what is their proper wild behavior, so to say. So that's why they were sort of going for these different trials and observing very closely. So I would, yeah.
So how different that would be from the European bison or lizard? I mean, also a sort of a species that had survived only in captivity.
The bison is a case that is close to the Przewalski horse, but there are others, for instance, the other ones that I'm studying, like the Vancouver Island marmots, they have a different story. Their problem is, so they decline in the wild because of predation. And so what the people doing the reintroduction are facing is how to limit this predation. And they are literally guarding the marmots on the top of the mountain from predators. They are trying to understand the behavior of wolves and cougars. They are not concerned that the marmots have changed their behavior in a few years in captivity, but yeah, they are more concerned about what is going on in the landscape, in the multi-species relationships in that landscape, and how to manage that sort of relationships in order to have a sustainable marmot population.
I was wondering, are you familiar with the reintroductions of forest reindeer in Finland? Have you read about that?
I know reindeer are reintroduced across a lot of places, but I don't know much about this case.
Because your talk got me thinking about it, all the complexities involved in reintroductions of species, and of course the forest reindeer in Finland. I mean, it was extinct from Finland because it has been hunted to extinction in the 18th and 19th centuries, but they made a comeback from the Russian side in the 40s and 50s and established a herd in eastern Finland, and Finnish biologists captured individuals from that herd and reintroduced them to other places in Finland, and they actually are doing quite well in some places, but in eastern Finland, where the original herd was, I think one of the big problems is that our big predators have made a comeback. So I mean, there's a lot of wolf predation at the time, and now the western herd is actually in trouble because of windmill construction. Because I mean, they prefer very remote places, and that's of course where people want to build windmills. So I mean, you can see all the different interests and conflicts that are there in reintroduction of wild animals.
Each project and each species is quite specific, has their specific dynamics. It's really hard for me because I'm doing this global history of reintroductions, but it's actually a hard thing for me to generalize.
I was thinking about one thing. I mean, you mentioned some of the success stories like the California condor or the whooping crane in the US, but it got me thinking. I really haven't read too much about this, but I mean, it's actually pretty interesting. This sort of a weird ironies and paradoxes in conservation history and reintroduction of almost extinct animals into the wild, that you have the hunters playing a part in that, and that's of course true in the US also, where you have sort of an elite hunters club who are concerned about the welfare of some species, so they play big part in reintroductions of the bison and protect the pronghorn antelope and the elk and all those species. But it also has these interesting ties, and I think they sort of came up during your talk about nationalism, because one of the driving forces with the American early conservation movement and reintroduction and protection of wild animals is of course partly nationalism, because these are our species. This is the only place where we have the bison or the pronghorn antelope or something like that. And you could sort of tell that the Russians or the Soviet system wasn't that interested in the nationalistic aspects of the horse, but the new Mongolian government was really interested in that. So can you tell me a little about the nationalism and the Przewalski's horse?
It's an interesting notion, because the word that they use for bringing back the horses to their homeland the word for homeland is nutag. And nutag doesn't mean only country or nation. It means the birthplace. And Mongolians have a lot of spiritual meaning attached to this birthplace. So in a way, the nation, I would say, is a very diffuse term, and it might be different from what we understand and from nationalism. They think about the birthplace as the place that one has ties to, and that is why also they were very keen to bring the horses to the Dzungarian Gobi, which was their known historical habitat. There were a lot of discussions at the time whether the Dzungarian Gobi is actually a good place for the horses because it is so dry and harsh, and because they thought there wouldn't be anyone who would like to take the job. And there were other areas considered, and there was this sort of theory that horses are steppe animals, they are not desert animals. Right, so in a way they said, well, the Dzungarian Gobi is not the optimal habitat, but it is the very last corner, where the very last refuge where they were pushed by human encroachment. So, but again, the Mongolians were very keen having them in this historical habitat, in their what was called the birthplace of the Taki, and also having, yeah. So it is, yeah, they, of course, they also mobilized a lot, the reintroduction of the Taki for, so to say, nationalistic purposes, also to position themselves in the international conservation landscape, because it was a time when Mongolia was receiving a lot of foreign aid. And there were a lot of international conservationists, big names like George Schaller, for instance, coming to work in Mongolia. So for them, it was a national pride that they managed to bring back the horse, of course. So there is a lot of, yeah, to unpack there with nationalism as well. But it's interesting that it was national pride, but at the same time, there was a lot of, there were this international figures that were helping this project out.
Okay. Yeah, I won't ask too many questions because I like to have the audience to have their chance also. I was just wondering, I mean, so if we think about the situation in the, let's say, 1960s, 1970s, how many European zoos would have had the horses at that time?
So I think by the beginning of the 1990s, from my research, there were around 150 zoos and reserves in the world that had them.
Okay.
So there were a lot. And this number, of course, not all of them were keeping breeding groups. Some had like only one animal for display, or maybe one breeding pair sometimes, because especially in the 60s and the 70s, the practice was to sell a pair that were often siblings. So that would increase inbreeding, and sometimes they didn't reproduce. So yeah, I think they are one of the species that are the most sort of widespread in zoos around the world. And while in the beginning of the 20th century, it was really the most wealthy zoos that afforded them, like the Paris Jardin des Plantes, or yeah, the Bronx Zoo in New York. Yeah, throughout the 20th century, they became more affordable, so to say.
Yeah, I was just because, yeah, if you wanted to comment on the role of that zoos have been playing during the last 100 years or so, because I mean, I think most Finns, of course, we have the Korkeasaari Zoo, which is a pretty old zoo, I think dates from 1880s, and obviously, I mean, it was just a place to go and see animals, but I mean, it took on this conservation role pretty early on. So I think most Finns are familiar only with the zoo that has some sort of conservation purpose. But of course, I mean, for much of the 20th century, I think, I mean, it's just another business for many people, and yeah, I was struck by
entertainment.
and the entertainment, and then also, I mean, you can see that if I think about the North American experience, you have this Frank Buck person who trades in wildlife, and he's a sort of a 1930s hero, and I mean they make short movies about him, and he's on bestseller lists. And even all the way to the early 1960s, I remember it's been shown on TV also, but I mean, there's this Howard Hawks movie called Atari that stars John Wayne as a person who catches animals.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah,
I should look at it.
yeah, it's pretty interesting. But yeah, and that's still in the early 1960s, and they are heroes and they are making money by catching animals for the zoos. But I mean, which would be unthinkable, I think, 20 years later. So I mean, there's been a real big change in there.
Yeah, I was very keen to tell you all the details about the history of the horse, but of course there is a lot of contextual sort of richness here, and you have the environmental movement in the 60s and the 70s that brings this sort of critique to animal trade, and also looks at zoos as institutions that are not doing well from an animal welfare point of view, and so the zoos are under pressure to change their practice. There are also the international treaties that ban the trade in endangered species, and so the zoos are seeing themselves in a corner because with many species they would just supply animals from the wild constantly, and they were not even very good at breeding species. So there is also a zoo revolution there with, for instance, nutrition and breeding in zoos. And the zoo specialists come, like, they, suddenly they have to know a lot about these animals in the wild. What do they like eat? How do they actually breed in the wild? Because it's not enough just to put a male and a female together. So there is a lot of context, historical context.
That brings me to my last question, and that would be, what is sort of a genetic situation of the species at the moment? Because I mean, there were so few horses originally. So are there any sort of genetic bottlenecks that have been seen, or hereditary disease or things like that?
So there were studies already from the 70s and the 80s that show that because of this history of inbreeding and captivity, the horses had reduced fertility and longevity, and also they had several sort of diseases like inconsistent gait, some sort of muscular paralysis that happened. But overall, the result of these studies show that the situation was not that bad, so to say, like comparing it to other species and what can actually happen in this kind of situations where you have a tiny genetic pool. They thought the Przewalski horses have been very lucky. So the population, this small population, was actually quite free of what is called deleterious genes. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I would have many more questions, but we are running out of time, so please turn it over to the audience.
Go online. Go online.
Oh.
Who wants to? Do you want to
Because
moderate?
there are some questions online that
Okay, yeah, let's
people, not really a question, but there is two people are thanking for a great presentation in the beginning, and then there's Anastasia Fedotova who points out that if Anastasia is not mistaken, things are going quite well in the Orenbrunn steppes. Is that correct?
So there was another reintroduction in the USSR that started in 2015, not in the USSR, in Russia, in like what, yeah, in started in 2015, and there was a lot of political pomp actually there with Putin attending the reintroduction. So there is the connection with politics and nationalism and all of that. But I'm not, I know they planned it very well, but I haven't looked actually at follow-ups from that. And as I was trying to convey, it's quite difficult to actually know from official documents and from reports what is actually going on, because there is a lot of pressure to present things as going okay, while in fact, we don't know always. what is going on. But yeah, maybe Anastasia can help me to retrieve some of the facts from that and be up to date.
But yeah, it's fascinating that how well some introduced species can do, even when the number of the introductions was really small. If you think about Finland, which is a sort of exceptional case because we have this only big population of white-tailed deer in Europe, and I mean, which was introduced in the 1930s. And I think the total number of those North American animals that came to Finland in two different locations was 120 individuals, and now we have I don't know 60,000 to 70,000 of them, and they are hunted and doing fine. So I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So small genetic pools and inbreeding can really, like, it's a lottery in a way, like what happens. It depends on those animals that are actually there. Yeah.
There's more animal ages.
More. Yeah.
We know how it collapsed last year. So why the population size went down, and when it went up because of the social structure, so they group the horses differently, so they migrate better, or what was the...
So over the years, the horses indeed they increased their migration capabilities, and the population was more dynamic because there were, say, increased number of stallions that were challenging the older harem stallions, so to say. And while in the beginning of the 2000s, for instance, you had this one stallion Pass who had a group of 20 mares. After 2010, for instance, they started to have very small groups, like 4 or 5 mares with a stallion. And so indeed they covered a lot of territory. What they did was also to release the horses already at different locations. So they would cover more territory, and when they meet, eventually they share this kind of knowledge, or when they mix the groups. So indeed what they saw was an expanded movement. And why they crashed last year was again because of the same phenomena, because of the zoos, because of the harsh conditions. So while they survived better this time, not that much better. So in a way, there is some increase in self-sufficiency, but still there are many challenges. I think that's what the lesson of this is. And I think the very big lesson of this is that this kind of projects take decades, if not like a century, to actually start to have self-sustaining populations.
And do you think that any laws have influenced that it can be extinct again, that it's now doing quite well? For example, I think around 1966, the endangered species act came, and other acts and laws came, more environmentalists came, more for empowerment from government. Do you think in some cases that also laws that have been implemented had a good effect on this case?
What do you mean?
Well, I think when the reintroduction of species and endangered species acts came, and people and also government were implementing laws, I mean, there were more reserves came, all this started coming up. Do you think that government or laws have like affected this?
Of course, there is. I think what is important there, of course, there are more protection laws, so to say. But what really makes a difference is an accumulation of knowledge and like these experts sort of gaining experience with these kind of projects. Like more than, because of course there is also, for instance, like in Mongolia in general, there are a lot of laws that limit wildlife hunting. It is a very big problem, like with wolves and many other species, there is a lot of poaching going on. And there are laws that prohibit that. However, on the ground, they're not very well enforced. So there is still poaching going on. So the power of the law is quite ambivalent. It does help in certain situations, but not always. But there are others. So if we look at the history of reintroductions, for instance, in general across the globe, there is one law in the United States, the Endangered Species Act, that was absolutely groundbreaking, and it did have a huge impact. But that was like unreplicated elsewhere in the world, like the power that law had to fundraise, to bring funds, and to bring experts to the problem of recovering species. So it is, in theory, we see that the laws can have a huge impact, but in practice, they are not always working. Yeah.
We have one question online. So Anastasia, kindly open your microphone and ask.
Mm-hmm.
Hi everyone. Hi Monica and Mika. Monica, I'm sorry I had to ask this. Ask this question. Say this as an offer to you, like an idea, probably a year ago or more. Why you don't compare your cases with more usual animals, like there were dozens and dozens reintroductions and introduction of some useful animals like Mustelidis, like sable, and all these attempts that was not like we will reintroduct these few couples of sable to this place and everything would be okay. Now they came again and again, they brought more sables. So probably 1 dozen of them of 100 survive. So this not very successful introduction and reintroduction is quite usual things, and all these specialists in this programs was not only in Soviet Union, but probably in Soviet Union they are more famous than in other parts of the world, and nobody expected that we would bring some few animals and they would prosper. Now they expected that they would, the specialist would need to come back again and supplement this small population. I will send you the paper about sable and other mustelids reintroduction. It's quite good one.
Mm-hmm.
So probably it's a bit too late on this stage of your.
I did look like superficially also at other. So one of the things was that, of course, we have a limited amount of time and you want to go very much in depth with several cases, and then the problem is, how do you select those cases? And I looked at different failed reintroductions. So what were called declared failed reintroductions. And my initial idea was to include some of those because they are very frequent. However, at the end, I thought, okay, maybe I do not take this, not to have such a heterogeneity of different situations, but I take this sort of very long and famous cases and to go in depth over different decades with these projects.
Yeah.
So just a pure pragmatic how I conceived the structure of this project. But of course, there are many situations where you had reintroductions that completely failed, or people that reintroduced animals, a couple of animals, and they sort of lost track completely for 30 years, and then they rediscovered, for instance, marmots in Romania. They reintroduced them in the 40s. They didn't know anything about them, and suddenly in the 80s they realized, oh, there's a lot of marmots here. What happened?
And
There are a lot of situations like this.
there were quite a few attempts to introduce European what is the most elite animal that almost pushed out by American one in
mink.
Yeah, European mink. So there were quite a few attempts to make a population on some islands, so to save this species. And as far as they know, all of them either failed, either nearly failed. And
one project in Estonia that was successful.
Yeah, and there were in Russia. There were on some islands, and some animals or plants which later become invasive, as this deer in Finland. This deer in Finland, everything went okay, but sometimes it was made attempt after attempt after attempt, and they were not doing well, and in few decades it become invasive, and now we don't know what to do with this plant or animal.
But yeah, I'm afraid we are running out of time. We could go on because I mean we just started really. But good to see you, Anastasia. And yeah, I mean, I would like to remind you that Helsinki does have an excellent zoo, and the zoo has Przewalski's horses. It has the Kulan, the Asian wild ass, and also the European minks. So I mean, you can actually go and see that. I mean, there are not many vesico in Finnish around. So please go and check it out.
Thank you very much to everybody.